Hello there, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name, still Paul Mount. We've had a bit of a downpouring of snow, or dumping of snow here in South Wales today. It's been very pretty watching the snow coming down. Temperatures are dropping as I'm recording this. In the cinema room, it is -1 degree. Not in here, because I've got the heating on, obviously, but it's a chilly day. And it's not even officially winter yet. I think winter is December, January, February. And here we are, middle, end of November, and we're getting cooler weather and some snow. So, shape of things to come, maybe. I've been watching some TV today for future videos and a film which I'm going to talk about in this particular video, as you'll have gathered from the thumbnail. When we look back and think of sort of 1980s cinema, we often think of it with a slightly rosy glow. I think where the 70s had been sort of slightly bleak and with a lot of social realism towards the end of the decade, moving a bit more into rediscovering being entertaining and telling fantastical, imaginative stories. The 80s embraced that ethos fully. And the 80s gave us, of course, the continuation of the Star Wars saga. Indiana Jones in his greatest adventures. We had the Back to the Future series launching. We had, of course, the classic E.T., which has never been a favourite of mine, but I appreciate that it was a huge hit and had a massive cultural impact on people. We had things like Willow. We had Dark Crystal, we had Never Ending Story, we had Who Framed Roger Rabbit. We had lots of films that were colourful and bright and breezy, and they're films that have stood the test of time, largely. They're films that people think fondly of and can rewatch now quite happily because there's that nostalgia factor. It takes you back to certainly a better place we're in at the moment, and it just makes us feel a little bit warm and comfortable. One film that doesn't get talked about very often, though, and it's part of that group of films from the 80s, is The Goonies. 1985 film from Amblin Entertainment, which of course was Steven Spielberg's production arm, directed by Richard Donner, and I think it was written by Chris Columbus, who did Home Alone, and it was sort of a Steven Spielberg idea, I think. And it's one of those films that came out and people went to see it and they quite enjoyed it, but it didn't leave any cultural footprint. It's not a film that gets talked about much today. There was never a sequel. There has been talk of sequel for years ever since. And in fact, the reason I'm doing this video today is because fairly recently there's been talk of a sequel. Even now, all these years, nearly 40 years later, those rumours have been thoroughly squashed by some of the cast. So The Goonies is a one and done. And as I say, I'd never seen it before. So I thought, with this talk lately about it, resurgent of interest, I would give it a look. And in the words of the end tune by Cyndi Lauper, who was huge at the time, I am asking the question, are the Goonies good enough? No, they're not good enough, frankly. This is a difficult one in a way because on this channel I try to keep fairly upbeat. I try to keep positive. I try to be constructive. I don't like just posting videos slagging things off that people like just for the sake of it, just for the clicks. So I try to be honest and I try to be constructive, and if I don't like something I'll try and say so. But what I'm never going to do on this channel is pick a film I don't like and then shout and scream about why you shouldn't like it either. You may well like this film. You may well like The Goonies. You may well have very fond memories of it from 1985. It may be a film that sits alongside E.T. and Back to the Future and Star Wars and all these films. It might be part of the bedrock of your youth. And I think the difficulty in watching films like this 40 years later that you haven't seen before, I've got no connection to this film. I've got no anchor to it. I've got no memories of it. All I know of it is what I have heard people say about it. Not necessarily in a positive way either. But I always go into these things with an open mind, and I thought, well, perhaps I will get the buzz for this film. Perhaps I will connect with it and understand why people like it. However, I sat through it this afternoon in 20-25 minute chunks, to be honest, because I actually found it rather difficult to get on with, to say the least. In fact, I didn't like it. It's as simple as I really didn't like this film. This is quite a drab sort of story, really. There's nothing fantastical about it. The protagonists in it are a bunch of kids. The villains are a bunch of sort of family of bad guys. And the stakes seem quite low. The whole look of it is actually quite cheap. I mean, it cost 19 million to make, which was a substantial amount at the time. And I think it made something like 125 million at the box office. It was a hit. But I think the fact that they didn't rush to do a sequel shows that it wasn't considered something that perhaps needed or deserved pursuing. It feels very insular because most of the action takes place indoors, underground, and there's not a lot of breathing space to it. There's not a lot of action beyond the environments of this location. The story of the film, as you will know if you've seen it, it's about a bunch of kids who are living in the Goondocks area of Astoria in Oregon. They're a mismatched bunch of kids from different households who call themselves the Goonies, and they presumably have had and have adventures in the neighborhood, and they're about to lose their home. It's going to be foreclosed. They're going to have to relocate. And they decide to have one last adventure, which coincides with them coming across a 1632 doubloon and an old treasure map that purports to lead to the treasure of legendary pirate One-Eyed Willie, who is believed to be located somewhere nearby, somewhere in the area, considered to be an original Goonie for some reason. These kids band together and they try to find this treasure, and they see in this treasure a possibility to raise money that will save their homes. The Goonies set off in pursuit of where they think the treasure is in a nearby derelict restaurant, but that restaurant turns out to be the hideaway of a family crime syndicate called the Fratellis. The two groups sort of merge together, and eventually the Goonies find treasure and this sunken galleon. The Fratelli family obviously wouldn't mind getting a bit of that themselves, and the two groups are sort of in conflict with one another. Broadly speaking, that is what I gathered the plot to be. I just didn't get on with the film. And the reason I didn't get on with the film is because of the Goonies themselves. I mean, one of the things I was told about this film is very noisy. Good God, it's noisy. It gave me a headache. Well, it would have given me a headache if I watched it all the way through in one go, but I had to stop and start it because I found the core characters so bloody irritating and so loud and brash and shrill and shrieking. And they did that thing that you find sometimes in kids' films. These kids are all so excitable and so loud, and they all want to dominate the dialogue and dominate the proceedings. They're all shouting over one another. And it's like, please give it a rest. One at a time, please, one at a time. The worst offender of me was a character called Chunk, because he's a bit fat. Get it? See what they did there? He's played by Jeff Cohen in one of his only film roles. What an irritating boy. I was going to call him something much worse than that. He is just constantly wailing and shrieking and screaming at every situation, everything he comes across. And okay, admittedly he comes across some nasty things, but it's constantly howling and the rest of them are a little better, really. There's lots of screaming and shouting, and they're all vying for attention as characters or as actors. It's hard to tell. But there's this constant wall of sound right the way through this film. These kids will not shut up. And I just didn't like these kids because of that. I wasn't interested in the characters. I felt that the story was just too meh. Is that it? It didn't have that extra wow factor that you wanted in a fantasy films, particularly at this time when fantasy films were breaking out and making the use of new technology and telling big stories. This just seemed very small and very parochial and just not very visually interesting. It tried to do Indiana Jones type stunts and things with rope bridges and boulders falling and traps and things, but I just didn't find any of it particularly engaging. And as I said, I found the performances from the cast, and I'll talk about them in a moment, frustrating because it was hard to get interested in any of them because they just were noisy and irritating and very self-obsessed. The adult characters, the Fratellis, I mean, this was interesting because it was an odd one in many ways, this film, because it did what I think some films did in the 1980s. They hadn't yet found that safe ground for a children's film. So they would do things that they thought might bring adults in. So the kids swear a little bit. They're constantly going, shit! And there's references to bodily functions and sexual innuendos. And there's a character in it who's the deformed brother of the Fratelli family. And he's actually quite nasty looking for a film that's apparently aimed at a younger audience. He has the look of somebody from Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes. He can't communicate. He's a bit manic and a bit wild, even though he befriends Chunk as the film goes on. He's, as a visual thing, he's quite sort of blunt, and you sort of think, wow, they didn't seem to know where quite to pitch this film. It's as if they wanted to make a kids' film, but they wanted stuff in it that adults who were dragged along with the kids might sort of get a little wry smile from. but I just found it uneven and a film that didn't know quite what it was. It was a bit sort of schizophrenic. So all in all, I didn't really enjoy it, is what I'm saying here. And it's a shame because the young cast, you've got people like Sean Astin, of course, who's gone on to sort of legendary cult fame in the three Lord of the Rings films. Josh Brolin as a sort of teen in extremely unflattering 1980s clothes. Of course, we now know him from umpteen films, not least the Avengers films, where as Thanos, he destroyed half the universe. And as I said, Jeff Cohen, who mercifully didn't do much else. Corey Feldman. There were a lot of Coreys around in films in the 1980s, and they didn't have a good time with a lot of them. And of course, we had Ke Huy Quan, short round himself, as Richard Data Wang. And of course, he's had a bit of a resurrection in recent years, thanks to things like Everything or Everywhere All at Once and a few other things he's been in. But I didn't chime with any of these people. Now, I am not sitting here saying, this is a terrible film, this is an awful film. This is a prime example of a film of its time that is difficult to connect with now. You don't always find that. You find films from the 50s and 60s, sometimes you can find a way into them, and even though they look dated and they have dated attitudes and so on, you can connect with them because there's something in the story and the performances and the production that draws you in. But for me personally, I can only speak for myself, this didn't draw me in at all. I just found it noisy, loud, constant soundtrack of screaming kids and the music score, which was trying so hard to be John Williams but wasn't. And he was trying to evoke all that, obviously. This came in the 1985, so we'd had Raiders of the Lost Ark. We'd had E.T. We'd had these films that had set out these things. And this, I think, wanted to be part of that. And Richard Donner, an incredibly experienced director, I just felt he didn't have a handle on what this was. I don't think anybody did, really. But as I say, this is a film which I know a lot of you out there will love and enjoy, and it's an important film for you. And I hope that me not liking it doesn't make you unsubscribe, because I wouldn't like that. And it's difficult to talk about a film you haven't particularly liked when you know that it has a cult audience and it has a cult following and people do like it and possibly go back to it and have gone back to it a long time. I'm watching it now in 2024, nearly 40 years on, and it seems very much like a product of a different era. It feels very old-fashioned. The fashions, the clothes, the attitudes. It's all dated. And I think 80s films in particular often date a lot more than maybe 60s and 70s and 90s and more recent films, because there was a specific fashion sense, there was a specific look, and the music, the thudding sort of synthy music that punctuates the film here and there, including Cyndi Lauper's frankly awful Goonies a Good Enough song. So yeah, for me it wasn't good enough. It wasn't enjoyable, and I wasn't able to even see what people at the time might have got out of it. I think if you were 16, 15 at the time, perhaps you could have identified with these kids. And that is the important thing with these things, identification. You watch a film, especially when you're young, and you identify with certain characters. And you think, that could be me, or I wish I was having these adventures. As a slightly older person than the heroes of this film, I could not connect with them at all. And I also could not quite conceive of how people watching it then could connect with them. Basically, it was just the sheer cacophony of it that made me back away from it, and I couldn't embrace it. And as I said, I just didn't warm to the characters, wasn't hugely interested in the story, and it just felt extremely flat compared to a lot of the other films in this genre that were out in this decade. So The Goonies, I'm glad I've seen it. I'll never watch it again. There's nothing in it to draw me back to it again. But as I said, I'm not here to sort of trash a favourite film of yours. I'm just presenting my opinion that it didn't work for me. And I suspect a lot of that is because it's 40 years old and I didn't love it at the time. And I think it's, I often talk about classic TV shows, and there'll be a lot more classic TV show stuff coming up. And I talk about them, and I love them because they are capsules of when I watched them originally. And they remind me of that time, and I'm able to appreciate even now what they were then. And I appreciate the fact that production techniques have changed and acting styles have changed. I take that all into account, but it doesn't affect that emotional resonance that lots of things I saw in the past had for me. Goonies doesn't have that. I didn't see it in the past. I didn't consciously avoid it. It just never really broke through in the way that all those other things. It didn't have, despite being a noisy film, it didn't seem to have the noise to bring it up and bring it alongside all these other classics from the 80s. So yeah, I didn't have a good time with it, and I won't be watching it again. But I will be interested to hear from anybody who does cherish this film, and I hope you don't feel I've trashed it and made it feel like a film you shouldn't enjoy, because if you enjoy anything, whatever it is, I think that's great. I think people enjoying films, TV, books, whatever, we don't all like the same things, and I would be very interested to hear, one, if you really like this film, if you've seen it recently and thought it was great. But I suspect, as I know that my viewer base is slightly older than a lot of YouTubers, I suspect a lot of people from the 80s will have seen this film and perhaps have very, very fond memories of it. So I'd like to hear from all of you who've seen this film in the past and have fond memories of it and really like it. And I'd like to know what it was about this film at the time when you saw it that connected. I just think that even if I'd seen it back then, I would have thought, oh, for God's sake, shut up, you brats. That was just my main take from the film. Too noisy, too clattering, not very interesting. But that's just me. So anyway, let me know what you think and thought of the Goonies in comments down below. I am going to rate the film, and I know you'll hoot and howl at this, but I think I can give it only a generous 3.5 out of 10. I think. I mean, it was colourful. There was a lot going on, and it was, for what it was well made. But it seemed sort of low level compared to some of the other bigger films that were out there at the time. So anyway, that's me. I suspect my subscriber number is going to go whoop in the next few days, but I hope not. I hope you'll stick around and be adult enough to accept. It's just my opinion. That's all these videos are. My opinion. If you are new here, however, if you've watched this video and think, okay, I'll see what this bloke's going to come up with. Why not like and subscribe? Is what you need to do. The most important thing is to press the subscribe button, which is probably there, and like, and just say leave a comment, because I would love to know your thoughts about this film. Right, thank you for watching. I will see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.